All right, hello everyone and welcome back from coffee. We've got one more panel before lunch and then one after lunch to wrap up the day. So this panel is about China's relationships in Northeast Asia, sort of broadly construed. Right? And so the panelists are absolutely free to take that in any direction or shape that they wish. We've got four excellent speakers. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Larus of the Pacific Forum.
Thank you very much to the Center of Geopolitics for inviting me to attend today, this weekend's workshop. So I'm going to talk about China's intimidation of Taiwan and Taiwan's potential ability to respond to that intimidation and do a bit of a threat assessment. But I don't think I need to tell you Taiwan's proximity to mainland China. We have something like a map up here. You can see Taiwan is only about 100 miles off of the coast of China. It's quite close. And I believe you all know that China has long had the desire to unite Taiwan forcibly, if necessary, with China. And since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, has tried to realize his China dream, part of which is the, according to the CCP's, reunification of Taiwan with mainland China. The U.S. defense industry assessment varies. Sometimes you will hear, I think Hegseth, honestly, SecDef Hegseth just said in Shangri-La that attack appears to be imminent. Others have said 2027 is the year. Others are looking maybe a little further out to 2049. We don't know, and I can't tell you. So let's just see, what Taiwan, its ability to respond to such threats. So I'm looking at the good, bad, the ugly, the downside, the upside for Taiwan. Of course, the downside for Taiwan is a very robust, vibrant, strong military threat from China and most likely a weak response from Taiwan. China's influence operations, including United Front operations, media, and espionage in Taiwan, and divided domestic politics in Taiwan. The upside for Taiwan, you could say, is the economy, perhaps public opinion given a particular mood on a particular day, and U.S. support. Again, perhaps. Okay. So the military threat and Taiwan's response. So in the first 5 months of this year, more than 2,000 PLA aircraft have been detected, most crossing the unofficial median line in the Taiwan Strait. This is a 184% increase over the same period last year, okay? So the numbers are important, but the trajectory is more important. It's increasingly China's dispatching PLA aircraft into Taiwan's ADIZ, not the airspace, but ADIZ. That is also coupled with large numbers of ships as well as China Coast Guard. In early, May, just earlier this month, China carried out Straight Thunder 2025A drills, which the PLA described as a containment scenario for Taiwan, right? You may have heard that U.S. Admiral Samuel Paparo of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command said that these exercises are not merely drills, but they are rehearsals. They are rehearsals for potential invasion. He emphasized, as the U.S. Defense Department intelligence community emphasizes, that China has a clear intent and increasingly the capability. Typically, China is sending fighter jets, the J-10, J-16 bombers, as well as drones. What are they doing? They're trying to wear down Taiwan's defenses. Taiwan has, limited ability, to send so many pilots and so many jets up every time to respond. And so, of course, what China is doing is testing Taiwan's response times and also signaling resolve. At the same time, they send illegal fishing vessels out into Taiwan area and increasingly encroaching on Jinmen waters. Jinmen is very close, of course, to mainland China. A more recent development is the Shuiqiao bridges. These are extendable road bridges that are on sea-based platforms that literally create a bridge. They can be jacked up 400 feet, okay, according to the information I have, right? 400 feet up, and to allow, and by the way, they are self-propelled. They have self-propelled capability. So what this means is that they will have multiple mobile, attack land assets on them. And so they're jacked up high enough above the surf to bring them in directly to a beachhead, which avoids having to take a port in Taiwan because, Taiwan's territory is rather inhospitable to a D-Day kind of landing or maneuver. And so this is a new development. China has been testing them. We can see these with satellite imagery. Of course, we don't know, how successful they would be in a conflict situation, but that's a relatively new development. So Taiwan's response, Taiwan spends only about 2.5% of its GDP on defense. That's about US dollars 15 billion annually, which is not adequate for a country that faces an existential threat. They, of course, they buy advanced military equipment, mostly from the United States. There are very few countries that are willing to sell to Taiwan because of political sensitivities with China. And so U.S. arms sales have been actually quite consistent. I know you have all heard some of the comments that President Trump has made in his first administration, and the second about Taiwan. Despite his comments, though, U.S. arms sales have been remarkably consistent. Trump, in his first administration, approved at least 10 major notifications to Congress. Of course, Congress actually spends the money. That was up to about 18 billion US dollars, nothing to sneeze at. Biden administration, of course, continued arms sales, but only at about 6 billion, right? So that's less than half. However, the big, what's the fly in the ointment, the wrench in the works, is that there is a backlog of approximately $21 billion of arms that have yet to be sent, okay? And so there's tremendous delay in sending a lot of these deals, these packages, I should say, over to Taiwan. The most recent, though, of the packages included HIMARS, which are the high mobility artillery rocket systems, which would be extremely important in the case of an invasion scenario. Current Taiwan Vice President Bi Khim-hsiao, she has been adamant about Taiwan starting a DARPA-like institution in Taiwan. Geostat produces sophisticated aerial drones, and the Longda shipbuilding is building unmanned kamikaze surface ships, and she wants more R&D into these types of things. Taiwan has plenty of Army drone units, but in an invasion scenario, an attack scenario, they would be deployed and probably destroyed very, very quickly. One of the major problems is, for Taiwan's military, is its armed forces is quite understaffed, perhaps is a polite way of putting it. Taiwan's available manpower is about 12 million. I think that's pretty high because that's half the population. What, including male infants? I don't know. But the number of people who are fit for service is only about 1 million. Of that, right now, Taiwan's armed forces are only about 170,000. Some stats will say up to 200,000. They have more than 1.5 million reservists. But all in all, only about 300,000 of these people we talk about are readily deployable, okay? I don't have to tell you that Taiwan is a super aging society like Korea and Japan. If couples in Taiwan are not having babies, they're not gonna have a strong enough military down the road, if they even need one down the road, right? And so, the big question is, would the United States send boots on the ground, air cover, whatever, send a military to help Taiwan out? I say to the people of Taiwan, I don't want to send my kids if you're not ready to send yours. If you're not having kids, then why am I going to send American blood and treasure over, okay? And so they really... under previous administrations, they got rid of the mandatory military service. They went to 4-month service. It was a joke. And now they're up to 1-year service. It's a little less of a joke, but apparently the readiness is really just not there. Taiwan is now working on all of society's citizenry response. That if there is an invasion, that citizens will be able to respond to calamities, disasters. This is something relatively new. Some of it is really just training people in first aid, and that's going to have limited applicability in a real invasion scenario. Regarding public opinion on if they'd be willing to fight, INDSR, which is the think tank associated with Ministry of Defense in Taiwan, according to the most recent poll, nearly 70% of respondents said they would fight. But when you, scratch the surface, you dig a little deeper, it is contextual. It's contingent on if the United States is going to be there, Japan is going to be there, and so when you bring out like different scenarios, those numbers start to drop. They're only going to fight if someone else is going to fight with them. 75%, I thought this was interesting, 75% of respondents believe that the United States would intervene in some form, but it might be merely airlifting food and supplies, kind of like a Berlin airlift. When it gets down to would the United States become militarily involved, only 40% of respondents, so that's less. Okay. Yeah, Taiwan's economy is doing pretty well despite the tariffs imposed on it, and that helps, with funding for the military. So that's kind of a bit of a bright spot. The economy is led by semiconductors, AI infrastructure, things of that nature, which accounts for, 15-20% of Taiwan's GDP, so they need to protect that. A downside with the economy is energy vulnerability. 90%, I should say, Taiwan relies on imports for most, like 90% of its energy. It's oil and gas, LNG. It had 3 nuclear reactors, and it just closed the last and final one. So that would be a real problem in any kind of invasion scenario, that energy supplies could be cut off. The other thing, just quickly, because I realize I am running out of time, is divided society, divided government. Right now, the executive branch is run by President Lai Ching-te from DPP, but the majority in the legislature is the opposition KMT. And there is no love lost, between the two. The speaker in the legislature, the DPP speaker, actually started a recall movement, which was not started by Lai Ching-te, but was somewhat endorsed. And then that was responded by protests by the KMT. KMT is arguing that in this recall, and if legislators are recalled, there has to be an election within 3 months. And so this recall agenda is to undo the elections of 2024 and try to bring in a different legislature. Very quickly, Taiwan has a problem with espionage, and a lot of it's in the military. There were since 2020, Taiwan indicted about 160 people for spying. 60% were active military. In 2024 alone, there were 64 prosecuted, 44% were active military, others were events. And then you may have heard just this year alone that 4 soldiers, including 3 from the president's own detail, and 1 intel officer were convicted of passing information to China. So you couple that also with the media. China has a very strong media presence in Taiwan. Taiwan companies, Taiwan broadcast companies, they also do business in China. They don't broadcast a lot of negative stuff about China because they're trying to protect their business. So you have these divisions in society that actually questions where perhaps some loyalties would lie in a real invasion scenario. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for some really good comments to sort of kick off discussion on the cross-strait issue. Next up, we have Jemima Baar from MIT. But before turning the floor over to her, I just want to recognize on the record that in 2021 and 2022, she worked as a research assistant in the Center for Geopolitics when we launched the first 2 iterations of this roundtable, including coming out of COVID and putting the whole thing together. And if not for her hard work now, we wouldn't be here. For her hard work then, we wouldn't be here now in this new iteration of the roundtable. So some recognition of that.
That's very kind, Bill. It was a team effort. He's overstating it a bit, but it's a pleasure to be back. A quick disclaimer before I begin. I'm here in a purely personal capacity, so the views I'm going to be expressing today are just my own and don't reflect any past or present employers, affiliations, or institutions. So after Liz's excellent remarks about Taiwan, I'm going to shift our position on the map a bit north and focus my remarks today on the 2 constituent parts of the brief of this panel. That is, first, China's approach to its critical relationships, and second, these relationships in the Northeast Asian security context. And I will then try and pull some of the themes together at the end. So first, how does China approach its international security partnerships? And by talking about this, I hope to build a little bit on John Nelson Wright's remarks about the state of US alliances in the region by flipping the coin over and looking at China's own strategic partnerships, and also build on some of the comments yesterday about the infamous CRINC, or whatever you want to call the building relationships between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea yesterday. So China has what one might call a complex relationship with international relationships. It sees their benefits, but it's very conscious of their risks as well. And that, I think, is playing out particularly interestingly right now in Northeast Asia. So on the one hand, China's military cooperation with Russia, Iran, and North Korea advances several of its overarching strategic goals to include reshaping the global balance of power by weakening the US-dominated international security order. United in their rejection of what they would say is unilateralism, Beijing and its partners see Washington and its allies as the chief obstacles to their geopolitical resurgence. For them, restoring past grandeur requires not only the pursuit of revisionist territorial claims, but also securing spheres of influence commensurate with their perceived status and power. So in Russia, Iran, and North Korea, China has willing associates that actively challenge the United States by asserting themselves regionally and thereby undermining the rules-based international order in both word and deed. China's engagement with these partners advances several strategic objectives, some of which are conceived in relation more particularly to its strategic competition with the United States, and other objectives that are a little broader than that. So first, these partners place sustained pressure on the United States. While they act independently, their actions collectively strain and stretch thin Washington's diplomatic, economic, and military resources. Managing, for instance, simultaneous challenges in Ukraine, to the Middle East, to the Korean Peninsula, stretches US capabilities and may potentially weaken its long-term resolve and capacity to exercise global leadership. Second, and relatedly, these partners distract Washington from focusing on the Indo-Pacific. Since it was first announced in 2012, the US's pivot to Asia policy has proceeded in fits and starts. And though the 2022 National Defense Strategy named the PRC as a pacing challenge, ongoing international crises have continued to stymie the United States' ability to engage in the Indo-Pacific as much as it may wish to. And this dynamic benefits China because it allows it to strengthen its influence in the Indo-Pacific while Washington is preoccupied around the globe. And finally, and this is the broader strategic point, it lays the foundation, these partnerships lay the foundation for a more multipolar world. By deepening military and strategic ties with these like-minded states, Beijing is actively cultivating an alternative power structure. In this evolving order, China seeks to position itself as a central pillar, expanding its influence and leadership on the global stage. It's worth also mentioning the operational and tactical benefits China derives from these partnerships. But here they depend a little more specifically on the partner in question. So, for instance, joint exercises with Russia have provided Chinese personnel with combat-relevant experience from a battle-hardened partner. Moscow's purported transfer of sensitive military technologies spanning submarines, missiles and stealth aircraft support the development of China's capabilities in these areas. And trilateral exercises with Iran and Russia in the Arabian Sea, which take place annually, have offered China valuable experience in conducting long-range naval operations, which advances Beijing's goal of building a true blue water navy. But despite the attention-grabbing headlines like the no-limits friendship between Russia and China, Beijing displays a degree of unease about closely proximate security relationships. The uneasy Sino-Soviet alliance lasted just 10 years, and though China and North Korea have nominally been allies since 1961, meaningful security cooperation has often been absent, and North Korea's military objectives have been undermined by China's intermittent support of international sanctions regimes in response to Pyongyang's nuclear weapons program and missile tests. Successive Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping, have continued to emphasize China's commitment to the, quote, non-alliance principle. So, though the announcement of China and Russia's no-limits friendship just days before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 shone a spotlight on the deepening relationship between the two states, officials on both sides continue to vociferously reject any portrayal of this relationship as a formal alliance. As recently as March 2023, where they where Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping specified that this relationship adhered to the Deng Xiaoping era principles of non-alignment, non-confrontation, and non-targeting of third countries. China's reluctance to form military alliances may stem from several factors. First, its historical experiences during the Cold War left lasting scars. Alliances with the Soviet Union and North Korea proved costly and were fraught with strategic divergences, which has reinforced China's wariness of entangling commitments. The Sino-Soviet split in particular demonstrated the perils of aligning too closely with another great power, while China's intervention in the Korean War underscored the dangers of being drawn into conflicts driven by allies' interests rather than its own. A bit more on that later. Second, the CCP's Marxist-Leninist governance model prioritizes centralized decision-making and, as much as it can, absolute control over domestic and foreign affairs. So foreign alliances, particularly those requiring mutual defense commitments, inherently involve devolving some degree of autonomy to others and opening China up to the specters of entrapment and abandonment, which contradicts Beijing's preference for flexibility in its foreign policy, where it seeks to maximize autonomy while minimizing the external constraints on its decision-making. And finally, each of China's potential allies are fairly aggressive actors with ongoing hostilities against other states. And so a formal military alliance with any of them could obligate China to intervene in conflicts that do not align with its strategic priorities or national interests. However, and this is really important, the lack of a formal alliance structure does not diminish the operational and strategic depth of these partnerships. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea's shared grievances against the current world order have already proven capable of shaping global conflicts in meaningful ways. The states have demonstrated a pattern of mutual support that extends beyond rhetorical alignment, and as Russia's case demonstrates, the absence of a mutual defense clause does not preclude substantial military aid. So with that context in mind, I'd like to zoom in a little on Northeast Asian security. And there are myriad players in this region. I don't need to tell you that. China, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, Taiwan, and the United States. But I suggest we also include Russia in that list, particularly given its growing relationship with North Korea. Panels yesterday touched on Russia's growing activity in Southeast Asia, but this too is growing in Northeast Asia, and I think it was Edward on panel 4 yesterday in this room, quoting Sergei Shoigu, lauding North Korea for sharing the same trench as Russia, which I think we can take both literally and figuratively. So while the material content of North Korea's relationships with China and Russia in particular are shrouded in secrecy, it's perhaps important to note that Russia and North Korea have last year committed to provide, quote, military and other assistance if either party faces armed invasion. And I think an interesting comparison is to look at Russia and Iran's comprehensive partnership treaty, which was signed earlier this year, which doesn't have a mutual defense clause like that. So there is a special degree of closeness that Russia has awarded North Korea in particular. Now, historically, China has viewed North Korea, and actually continues to, as a buffer zone against potential threats from the US and its allies. And while Beijing has maintained a relationship with Pyongyang, it has always sought to control the pace and direction of that relationship, mindful of North Korea's unpredictability and the need to avoid fundamentally destabilization. So that's China's perspective, but therefore as Russia and North Korea increasingly collaborate, particularly in areas like military technology and economic exchanges, China finds itself facing a much more complicated dynamic in the Northeast Asian security environment. It's important, of course, not to overstate matters. I, for one, don't subscribe to the idea that a wedge can be easily driven between China and Russia, or that Russia's growing relationship with North Korea is going to be fatal to China and Russia's relationship, or China and North Korea's relationship for that matter. And also importantly, China has considerable leverage over both North Korea and Russia, particularly as serving, for the most part, an economic lifeline to each. But it's also important to note for China that growing bond between Moscow and Pyongyang does threaten its position, even slightly, as the primary strategic partner for North Korea. There's an inherent discomfort in China's mind in this relationship, which is informed by ghosts of the past, when, in particular, Mao felt as though he'd been double-crossed by Stalin and Kim when he intervened in the Korean War, but then wasn't in turn supported for his ambitions in Taiwan. So that's to underscore that history matters in general, but particularly in China. And so the rise of a Russian-North Korean relationship that doesn't quite play by Beijing's rules or in Beijing's interests is a cause for concern. So to conclude, the evolving security dynamics between China, Russia, and North Korea highlight the complexities and uncertainties that China faces in managing its international security relationships. Partners present considerable opportunities to Beijing, but also considerable risks. And so as China looks to the Northeast Asian security environment, it perhaps knows better than most that while it holds many of the cards, it doesn't hold them all.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And next up, we have Rupert Schulenburg of the Institute for International and Strategic Studies.
Thank you, and thank you for the Centre for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. So my remarks today focus more so on the Northeast Asian context component of the panel, namely the environment China is operating in as it looks across the Taiwan Strait to achieve its goal of unification. So for the last 5 years or so, China has significantly increased pressure on Taiwan, such as through large-scale exercises, and also made important military capability advances. There's been this phenomenon of what can be termed the internationalization of the Taiwan issue. And this broadly describes increased or novel engagement by countries on the Taiwan issue, other than the United States, but then also greater efforts by the United States to integrate its allies into its approach towards Taiwan. This was made quite clear early on in the Biden administration with its 2022 Indo-Pacific Security Strategy document, stating that we will work with partners inside and outside of the region to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So to give some examples of this internationalization, US allies have increasingly spoken up on how a contingency would affect their own security and interests and also threaten global prosperity. So in East Asia, for instance, Japanese officials have emphasized that peace and stability of Taiwan are directly connected to Japan, and JMOD's defense white papers have routinely begun to include a line on how stabilizing the situation surrounding Taiwan is important not just for Japan's security, but that of the international community. And similarly in Southeast Asia, the Philippines has also emphasized how a contingency could affect its own interests. Its 2023 National Security Policy document, for instance, noted major concern that a crisis over the island would inevitably affect the 150,000 Filipinos on Taiwan. And then even in Europe, countries have begun to increasingly focus on what a contingency might mean for themselves. The Financial Times reported in late 2022 that the North Atlantic Council held its first dedicated talks on Taiwan during which NATO ambassadors discussed the variety of impacts that a contingency would have on Euro-Atlantic security. And then the US has also piggybacked off those statements, regularly emphasizing that cross-strait stability is an international interest and that a crisis over the island would have damaging consequences across the globe. At the 2023 Shangri-La dialogue, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said that the whole world has a stake in maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. In 2024, then Secretary of State Kurt Campbell highlighted that a conflict over the island, given how it would disrupt global supply chains, particularly in regards to semiconductors, could cause a global Great Depression. Jointly, the US and its allies have also spoken about the importance of cross-strait stability. Over the last few years, in joint statements with now 9 of the United States' former treaty allies, they've included a phrase along the lines of, "We underscore, emphasize, or reaffirm the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait." And these statements began to then gradually include a line on how this is a, quote, indispensable element of international peace and security. But beyond countries just talk about their concerns and a contingency, there have been a smattering of statements in which some US allies have even spoken about how US allies might get involved in a contingency. In 2021, then the Deputy Prime Minister of Japan said that if a major incident occurred over the island, this could be considered an existential threat. In such a case, Japan and the US might have to work together to defend the island. That same year, then the Australian Minister of Defence said that it would be inconceivable that Australia would not help the US defend Taiwan were they to take that action. The Philippines has also suggested some level of involvement. The country's ambassador to Washington last year said that if our defense establishment finds it possible for us to use the EDCA sites, so the sites the US and Philippines have shared access to in the country, because it will affect us, then they might authorize the use of the sites. And then even US officials have sometimes stressed that US allies would likely take some form of a contingency. And then 2021, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said there are many countries, both in the region and beyond, that would see any unilateral action to use force to change the status quo as a significant threat to their peace and security, and they too would take action in the event that that happens. Biden made a similar statement a couple of years later. And even a particular military capability has been invoked when Secretary Campbell was talking about the AUKUS partnership. He remarked that the agreement has the potential to have submarines from a number of countries, thereby implying more than just the United States, operating in close coordination and could deliver conventional ordnances from long distances, which could have enormous implications for a variety of scenarios, including cross-strait circumstances. Western responses to Russia over Ukraine have even been cited by US officials as a means of helping protect Taiwan. US officials have stressed how the international coalition's collective punishment of Russia through unprecedented economic sanctions helps strengthen deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, as it demonstrates to other potential aggressors that countries will come together and impose costs for this kind of aggression. Then CIA Director Bill Burns, writing in Foreign Affairs, said that the West's ability to both inflict and absorb economic pain could have an impact on Xi's calculus over Taiwan. But the question that then flows from all these actions is, did they actually help to shape China's calculus and behavior? For instance, could repeated warnings of how economically costly a conflict over the island would be help to give Chinese leaders pause, given their concerns over regime instability? I'm sure we've all seen those studies, such as by the Rhodium Group, that found that a conflict would cause $2 trillion in economic losses, and that's before factoring in sanctions and other second-order effects. Bloomberg's estimate, I think, was around 10 trillion, but that was factoring in sanctions and other associated effects. And then could suggestions of potential allied involvement also increase concerns amongst Chinese leaders that US partners would actually get involved, especially as they make important military capability advances and increase defense cooperation with the United States. After all, US allies could make important contributions in a contingency, such as providing the US with basing access, which would be essential, particularly in Japan, for the US effectively delivering air power in the region. But on the US side, at least, US officials have claimed that this international engagement on the issue is contributing meaningful effects. Secretary Campbell has stated on numerous occasions that US allies speaking out about their desire to maintain cross-strait peace, for instance, assists in deterrence, plays a role in deterrence, and signals a desire to deter aggression. Similarly, writing in Foreign Affairs in 2023, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan wrote that even allies in Europe are helping the United States support peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, although they did not detail exactly how. The Taiwanese government has also welcomed this kind of internationalization effort and also encouraged it. Then in 2024, the Taiwanese Foreign Minister Joseph Wu, also writing in Foreign Affairs, wrote that peace across the strait can be maintained only by viewing and treating it as an international issue. And Reuters reported in 2021 that Taiwanese officials had reportedly approached European officials about creating plans to sanction China in the event of an invasion and to privately warn China over such plans. And then looking at China's reaction to such actions has, of course, as you'd expect, been quite highly negative. Foreign Ministry has described it as highly dangerous for the US to try and turn the Taiwan question into an international issue that has given China grave concerns and strong dissatisfaction, has condemned joint statements through a further cross-strait peace, and Japan's linkage of its own security to that of Taiwan as crude interference in its internal affairs. And beyond the government, Chinese scholars have also highlighted concern with increased engagement on the Taiwan issue and the implications it would have for the island. One scholar at the think tank CICIR, for instance, wrote that Western sanctions on Russia, combined with the linkage between Ukraine and Taiwan, implies that the US will work together to form a coalition to impose collective sanctions with the same vigor in a similar scenario. Scholars have also written at that same think tank that in attempting to make the Taiwan issue more international, the US is trying to manufacture obstacles to China's reunification. I think views on Japan is an interesting case because along with its language on Taiwan, it also made important military capability advances that have drawn particular concern about China's potential involvement over the Taiwan issue. So Japan is in the process of acquiring various types of long-range precision strike capabilities to conduct counterstrikes against an adversary's attacking forces from outside of their engagement zone. This includes capabilities such as the Tomahawk land attack cruise missile, the JASSM-ER, and indigenous systems such as the upgraded Type 12 anti-ship missile. And those would be exceptionally useful for attacking high-value assets such as missile launchers and surface combatants, which would be key to a Taiwan scenario. And beyond the Chinese government's stated concern with these issues, some scholars have gone further in expressing concern that these could be used to have implications for Taiwan. There's one scholar at the National University of Defense Technology, for instance, that wrote that a direct consequence of these acquisitions is an increase in the possibility that Japan could be emboldened to interfere in regional security affairs, especially Taiwan Strait affairs. Similar sentiment was expressed in Chinese state media. There was an editorial in the China Daily that described China's collaborative efforts with the United States, including its plans to acquire counterstrike systems from the US, as being aimed at compromising the reunification of the Chinese nation. So though we can see a clear uptick in this kind of international engagement on Taiwan, it's not to say that involvement in a crisis would be assured or straightforward. Last year, then, the South Korean Minister of Defense voiced opposition to US forces operating out of South Korea in such a scenario. Japan could well face legal obstacles had it not been already attacked, and sanctions would be quite the double-edged sword given the economic ties of many US partners with China. But you're interesting to watch how this internationalization effort continues, especially as governments change, and now with Trump 2.2 in the White House, and then also how the Chinese government and scholarly community reacts to these efforts as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And our final speaker is Yuka Kobayashi of SOAS, and also this year at the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, DGAP.
German Council for Foreign
German Council for Foreign Affairs. Very sorry. Sorry about that.
Thanks very much, Bill. Thanks for the kind introduction and the invitation to join you today. And it's a great pleasure. I'm delighted to be here on this roundtable to share some thoughts on China and Northeast Asia. So having these people speak, excellent speakers speak before me makes my job really easy. So I would actually say all of the above. And I'm going to now focus on a specific idea of connectivity to actually talk about how China's relations with Northeast Asian countries is impacting the Indo-Pacific and also world order. So all of these kinds of things hint towards actually Northeast Asia being a very kind of important forum for various dynamics in geopolitics, geoeconomics, and also technology. And so I'd like to argue that basically these relationships that China has or does not have with Northeast Asia has actually been key to impacting on the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific and also really shaking the world order. And what do I mean here? So we all know about how we've talked about alliances and Bill's 4 pillars, and I'd like to focus on the last pillar, which is this ideas, this thing about ideas, which I think is really interesting if you connect it with connectivity. Because we all all know about connectivity. We know about infrastructural development, and China is being very strong in this. But the other element of connectivity is you also have what holds these kinds of infrastructural projects, the ideas around it, the norms behind it, which I think is equally interesting, which shows kind of the fault lines that we actually see in Northeast Asia, which is impacting on in the Indo-Pacific. So what do we actually mean here? So we've heard about Global Gateway, we've heard about infrastructural projects in the Belt and Road Initiative. The other thing we haven't talked about is Japan's ideas of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which has been taken up by Washington about quality infrastructure, transparency based on rules of law. And it's interesting because this also has kind of direct impact in terms of relations with China and Japan, and also impacts the Indo-Pacific. So yesterday we talked about Southeast Asia, where we actually see in Myanmar the deep sea port of Jiaoqiu. The other thing we don't talk about is Japan also has the Yangon deep sea port. So the ideas around infrastructure are really interesting to look at the geopolitics, geoeconomics, and also ideas around them. So what I want to focus on is really taking the issue of Taiwan and taking a very different angle to this of connectivity. So we talked about Taiwan. The other thing is, we talked about how semiconductors were really important and really shifting sort of balances in trade in this region. So what's famous is this idea of TSMC actually having a partnership with Japan and actually having productions and cooperating. What we see these kinds of arrangements mainly because of China's rise industrially and China's rise technologically. And I think this is actually just not seen in terms of the hardware of things, but in the software of things. So another thing with Taiwan is that we actually hear about the Taiwan Straits crisis. So if we go back to the 90s, another thing that we don't really talk about with technology is what happened in the 90s with around the Straits crisis is that China actually did not have access to the GPS because they were blocked. And this really pushed China on their industrial and technological drive, which made things like China Made in China 2025, standards, et cetera. And one of the key things China really focused on is developing their own GPS system called Beidou. So Taiwan actually drove China to really develop these kinds of technologies, which really connects China with differently in a different system to the GPS. So you might have heard about the Belt and Road Initiative. But another layer is, what I love about this map that I've been viewing 2 days, is it also captures not the terrestrial element of what's happening geopolitically, but also what's happening in terms of digital platforms, right? So the digital Silk Road, what we actually see with China's sort of digital platforms being rolled out through the digital Silk Road. And another dimension is this Beidou system, which is the the space corridor element of the Belt and Road Initiative. So this actually touches on ideas around technology and connectivity. But what's behind this is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. These kinds of connections actually happen with norms, rules, and how we should connect, and how we should deal with the things that go through these fiber cables. What happens with the data? So if you look at China's relationship with Japan, you have China, data sovereignty. It's very clear in where it's going. And in terms of Japan, especially its presidency in the G7, they try to push forward this idea of data free flow with trust. Similarly, they also pushed forward things around economic security. So you actually see very different ideas about how we should be dealing with data governance, how we should be connecting, going back to the idea of ideas, people, and places. So in terms of geopolitics, I think connectivity allows us to really look at very interesting developments in this region. And if you look at sort of alliances, we actually looked at the hub and spoke system. We heard about basically the China, North Korea, and Iran sort of alliance. And here we also have technology. It's kind of interesting because I spoke to somebody from formerly a PLA who actually spoke about how China was very nervous about developments between North Korea and Russia in these areas. So the old alliance systems are really shifting, mainly because connectivity and technology is shifting the ways we connect, starting from Northeast Asia, impacting on the Indo-Pacific region, and really impacting on world order and digital order and space order. And I'll end my comments there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I guess before opening the floor completely, I would just add one very small comment, which is that it sounds as though China's relationships in Northeast Asia, broadly construed, are problematic, to say the least, which is that essentially we see the cross-strait relationship being one of increasing threat. I think several of you pointed that out. And then difficult relations, both with North Korea, Russia, other potential partners, but also with Japan, the United States, other key players in the region who might be potential adversaries or competitors to China. And then finally, this sort of significant shift, I think, in the terrain of ideas and discourse around the relationships and around what it means to have security relationships. And this very interesting insight about the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis spurring China's sort of digital warfare development, I think is an important insight, similar to the insight that, the observation of the first Gulf War by China, in addition to China's bitter experience 10 years earlier in Vietnam, in a much lower tech conflict, really spurred the modernization of the PLA, right? So these sort of, from the outside, perhaps not such important negative experiences can actually have really strong knock-on effects in terms of driving this discursive change inside China that then has ripples outside as well. So the floor is open for questions and comments from the audience. Let's start with Taka here in the front, and then we'll work our way around.
Thank you to the panelists. Really excellent discussion. I'm Takahiro Kamisuna from WWS Japan Chair Program. So my question is, I think, as a Professor Kobayashi mentioned, the connectivity, and then I just wonder, because in Japan or in the Indo-Pacific region, government official, academics, kind of fear that we quite have a dependency to China in terms of a critical mineral or supply chain. But I think also, I just wonder whether is there any opposite pattern, China, because also depends on somehow technology production from South Korea, Japan, for instance, even though Japan import a lot, 90% rare earth from China, but Japan produce some electric device, materials, and then they export to China again. And also China has an issue, if I could say that, so-called overcapacity, which they don't have any much domestic consumption, and the production is much way higher than the domestic consumption, that they actually need a market outside of China. So I just wonder how China need Northeast Asia as a trading partner, or in terms of their own domestic issue, own security issue. So that's the question. Thank you.
Great. And probably to Julia just behind.
Thank you very much for the wonderful panel. I have a question specifically for Jemima. Thank you so much for your talk. I was just curious to understand a little bit more as to the rationale behind taking together the actors like Russia, Iran, and North Korea into your analysis of China's relations. Because if we think about foreign policy priorities of China, they respond to different interests. They're generally treated very differently. So I was really curious to see what led you into taking them all together. Thank you.
Let's see, are there more on this side? In the back.
So a big chunk of a big chunk of the far east of Russia used to be Chinese territory. It's very rich in natural resources. It's underpopulated. I'm sure China would like to exploit that, but given that it was only in 1858 it lost that territory, how does that complicate the relationship?
Okay, let's see on this side. Let's start with John in the front.
This is a question for the entire panel, but also prompted by Yuka's observations about connectivity and cooperative opportunities. We've talked a lot about the security challenges that China poses and the sense of an adversarial relationship, but we've also seen recently, through the trilateral mechanism linking together China, South Korea, and Japan, a recommitment, an unusual recommitment to thinking about economic cooperation. even in that context, on the back of some of those recent meetings, the Koreans talking about a strategic dialogue with China. Can you reflect a little bit on where you think that economic partnership might go, and also in terms of the presidential election that will happen next week in South Korea, and the likely selection of Lee Jae-myung as the next president, with all of his statements on China, how that's being received in Beijing?
Okay, Suyan?
Thank you. Suyan Kim, University of British Columbia. This question is for Dr. Kobayashi. So you are in DGAP or GCAP this year. You must be smack in the middle of EU's global gateway projects. And oh, okay. So there are these 32 digital connectivity projects. And talk about ideas. There's a specific word that's associated with those global gateway projects. And digital connectivity is to be a trusted partner, right? And so I'm just sort of wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you've seen, what you've heard, and how much commitment there is maybe on the ground in Germany. That'd be great. Thank you.
And then Edward?
Thank you. You've mentioned China's unease, or China's difficulty, to use Bill's word, or nervousness with respect to the Russia-North Korea cooperation. How do you view this changing over time? There have been many reports that have gone further and said that China is angry. That I find is very difficult to believe, because if China were so angry, it could do two things, neither of which it has done. Number one, stop helping North Korea in evading sanctions. And even in 2017, when China did support sanctions, later on in that year, it was found to be helping North Korea evade sanctions. And the second thing is China could stop engaging in dual-use technology trade with Russia and enabling Russia's war.
Great. That's 6 questions. So I think we'll take those to the panel, and then if there are questions on this side from sort of Alexandra or Aditya back to the back, we'll come back to there if we can at the end, just to be sure everybody gets a chance to get their questions in. So let me invite the panelists to answer any or all of the questions posed either directly to them or to the panel as a whole in the order in which they originally spoke, please. So Liz, you're first.
No, I don't have a response at this point. Thank you.
Okay. Jemima?
Okay, right. I'm going to try and address a few of them. Just the point about China depending on, you mentioned particularly Northeast Asian countries. I'll say, yes, actually China, as much as it perhaps would like to be able to make its decisions relatively autonomously and have complete freedom of decision, that, as with any state, is impossible. And so, another extension, I think, of where you were getting at is if you look at its dynamics in Europe. It's in recent years as China's gone over and made serious overtures to Europe because 2022 was a bit of an inflection point where, because of China being a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine, European nations took notice of that, but also China took notice that they were taking notice. And so absolutely that interdependence is a really important dynamic. On the question of my rationale in taking them together, that's a really excellent point, because you're absolutely right. Analytically, there are very considerable differences. And indeed, even though they, for example, each of those states have interests in similar in that they are all seeking, to an extent, spheres of influence in their respective regions. They are they're fortunate in a way that they don't really overlap, but at the same time, they're also united by the fact that there's a lot of quite strong nationalism across all states, which sometimes does play into the dynamic. For example, with Russia and Iran, there was a lot of pushback in Iran over Russia using some Iranian bases to conduct air operations in Syria a while back. So certainly there are, in some ways, because they are quite similar in some of the ways that they are domestically, politically, that can also lead to tension. I think that joining them together is, while also recognizing that there are some considerable differences and they should be treated as, different cases. The reason for joining them together is because there is a unifying thread in, I would say, a general disgruntlement with how the international order looks, and particularly what they see as the US being, and they lump its allies together, having this kind of unilateral power, and they were pushing against what they see as hegemony. But I think the critical thing is, well, it's fine to be united by what they're opposed to, but then the question is, well, what do they want to come after? And I'm not sure whether there is a similar unifying thread that pulls them together about how they envision the world to look like were US hegemony to completely collapse. Regarding territorial disputes between China and Russia, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a critical point to raise, and I can't remember the map that China published a few years back, that even though nominally they had resolved their land disputes with Russia in the 2000s, the lines were somewhat curiously redrawn again in a map that I can't remember who it was, but some office in China published. So I think that's a critical point, because there are certainly areas of enormous convergence between Russia and China, but at the same time they have a long and complicated historical relationship that involves, for example, quite serious territorial disputes and not so recent, relatively recently as well. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And finally, the trajectory of the relationship. I think you're right. I mean, China, I think, is not perhaps so angry. I mean, it's not going to, but also perhaps, I mean, two things to be true at the same time, where it may be unhappy with that relationship between Russia and North Korea becoming closer, but also seeing that both of those states serve China's purposes. And so I don't think, my sense at least, is that in the medium term, those relationships are going to endure, precisely because I think there's a lot that unites those states, even if there are some areas of disagreement or a bit of discomfort.
Great, thanks. Rupert?
Just I'd say one thing on the area of shared concerns, but shared by Russia and China. I think earlier this month or late last month, they released a joint statement on risks to global stability, and one of the things they highlighted is their concern with the kind of proliferation. Is this my mic? Or? With the concern with an increase in long-range precision strike deployment. So one thing I particularly highlighted was non-nuclear states for deploying ground-based long-range precision strike. So from 2026, the US plans to deploy what is expected the mid-range capability to Germany, which is capable of launching the 1,600-kilometer range Tomahawk, which would then allow it to strike mainland Russia, and then also highlight a concern with non-nuclear armed states acquiring long-range precision strike. Again, that can attack the mainland with Japan's acquisition of the Tomahawk, which is a land attack cruise missile, and then also the deployment of the US mid-range capability to the Philippines, which also launches the Tomahawk. Both put the Chinese mainland in range, and it's quite interesting seeing particular concern from Chinese scholars that the increased capacity to actually hit the mainland by US allies is a particular concern. Then it's also curious, under what circumstances US allies would actually be willing to do that, and what kind of situation would they actually think it's worth, hitting the mainland of a country? Would that be alongside US forces? Would they be willing to do it without, given they're non-nuclear armed? And what contingency scenario would they actually be, interested in using that with?
Great, thank you. Yuka?
Thank you very much for those excellent excellent questions. I'm going to try to answer them all if I remember them correctly. Please stop me if I am misunderstanding some of the questions. The first question on Japan, I think the Japanese-China relations is a really interesting one. If you look back in history, Japan actually had the only journalist during the Cultural Revolution in China because of the Seikei Bunri of dividing politics and economics. So I think Japan still has this kind of tradition in their foreign policy, and especially since, if you even look at the more recent example like Huawei, where the UK and the United States and Europe really made a big deal out of it. It was a smaller deal, but Japan dealt with it very quickly and smoothly. So I think Japan actually really tries to kind of salvage that relationship, and then it overlaps with kind of the sort of loss of legitimacy of the CCP inside China, because essentially keeping the economy afloat is a major priority for China. So I think there you're actually seeing kind of very creative solutions where, from what I understand, there's even discussion around Japan and China to jointly develop infrastructure. And there's been statements, and I'm trying to track down what exactly is happening, but it hasn't been forthcoming. But this is happening at the same time we hear about quality infrastructure and, free and open Indo-Pacific that's opposing China's Belt and Road Initiative. So I think Japan's a very interesting case. And sort of those are my thoughts. I'm sorry it's not very conclusive. I think in terms of the Russian Far East, there's a lot of interest because it is an untapped potential in terms of natural resources, but it is also kind of an area that's been historically problematic. There has been a lot of discussion around natural sort of resources and tapping into that in these regions between China and Russia, but I think Russia has more recent priorities mainly being drawn into the European sort of theater now. But the space it needs to be watched what happens after, if there's any kind of resolution to really make Russia more look towards Asia rather than Europe being an Eurasian actor. In terms of the South Korean example, John, I'm not a really South Korean expert, but from the interviews I had with sort of experts kind of flying through Berlin, it's quite curious because I think, ironically, the example of China's unease with what's happening with North Korea is really kind of opening up different opportunities. It's not really clear cut where it is, but at the same time, we're actually seeing things like, for example, the nuclear issue being really discussed around North Korean security people, which I think is actually bringing South Korea together with Japan, information sharing, bringing it into this idea of the Asian NATO and NATO information sharing, from what I hear. So it's not just an office in Japan. Seems like there's actually more kind of structures around it, and mainly because of what we're actually seeing in North Korea, from what I understand, like where Putin and Kim met in that space facility, North Korea actually was failing at all these missiles in a particular sector for 2 times. But after that meeting, there was some kind of technological transfer which made North Korea succeed. So those kinds of developments are really bringing South Korea and Japan really tight in the security realm, and also sharing that with NATO is what I'm actually seeing. So you're also seeing joint exercises using NATO language with Operation Blue Skies. So I'm not a South Korea expert, but that's kind of the observation from Berlin, which I'm seeing. Now, in terms of global gateway, I'm not really seeing too much of it because this is actually from Brussels. But in terms of Berlin, when I arrived, after a couple of weeks, the Scholz administration collapsed. So I'm seeing a lot of domestic turmoil. And I think initially, before going to Germany, I thought of Germany as one of the leaders in the EU and a very strong actor, especially in industry and economy. But from what I'm actually gathering in my interviews in Berlin and Hamburg, it's actually very divided in the federal system. And domestically, they have a lot of more issues they have to tackle before they really even look at sort of like overarching issues. So I think domestically, they're actually really trying to bring the far right and all these kinds of different factions together. And I think foreign policy is actually taking a little bit of a back seat to a lot of these developments, to the extent that we don't really know who's looking at which portfolio. So a lot of the things stalled till Merz was actually elected. And did I miss anything else? Sorry, did I not answer anybody's question, or was that everything?
The last question of it, I think we pretty much answered, yeah.
Okay, Sorry, please catch me in the coffee break if I missed your question, but thanks for the excellent question.
Let's see, are there any questions on this side of the room in the last, say, 5 rows at the back? Anyone at all? Because I fear I may have missed you in the first round. So for another couple of questions, I see one over here. We'll take that question. Actually, that will be the last question, and then we'll invite the panelists to wrap up.
Thank you. I have quite a general question, but it's probably most relevant to Ms. Baar and Dr. Kobayashi. But I'm thinking about sort of how to analyze China's geopolitics. And I wonder if there's something lost if we talk about China in a very sort of state-centric way and talk about China wants this, China doesn't want that, what China does or doesn't do. But one of the key sort of developments since I guess the 1980s is the decentralization of political authority within China, so that provinces become more important, municipal authorities become more important, state-owned enterprises, even private companies, they start to, in a way, develop their own foreign policies, which creates a lot of messiness and makes it difficult to talk about necessarily what China wants or doesn't want. And we see not necessarily direct contradictions where, but certainly, like I say, a degree of messiness. And I'm thinking about even cases like China and North Korea. So of course, it's often been noted China's could be a bit duplicitous in terms of it signs up to sanctions, but it provides a lifeline to North Korean economic terms. But actually what we're looking at a lot of the time is these are actually different actors doing different things within China. So Beijing does the one thing, but much of the economic engagement in North Korea is actually driven by Liaoning province, Jilin province, as part of their own development strategies. Jilin is a closed, landlocked province, and it sees engagement in North Korea as a way of building infrastructure and then trying to break out of its. But you could apply this to even more so, I think, the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, right, where there's a lot of messiness there and different actors doing different things, and this idea of debt trap diplomacy is actually not so much necessarily an intention on the part of Beijing, but just an outcome of that. So that's I just wonder, is something lost if we try to put China in this sort of container where we say it's a single actor doing this and that? That's my question. Thanks.
Okay, before I throw it back to the panelists, I would just say that I think that's part of the overall agenda, certainly of the round table and of the center, is to unpack states a little bit and not think of them as just unproblematic unitary actors. China, yes, but not only China. Any of the states that we're talking about, indeed, is multifaceted as an actor, and there are non-state sort of social forces and societal components inside any state as well as the different parts of the state to which you alluded at both the national and subnational level. So yes, as far as I'm concerned, very well taken. Let's put it open now to the panel, again, in the order in which they spoke.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. I think certainly during Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao's reigns, whatever, the decision-making on China's security calculus, security issues, was perhaps more consensual, open to debate. Xi Jinping, much more, he's the chairman of everything, right? I'd love to be a fly on the wall in Zhongnanhai to know what the heck is going on over there, especially in the Ministry of Defense and in the defense apparatus over there. My understanding is at the the current Shangri-La dialogue going on right now that China did not send its top defense official, sent a one-star admiral. It's like the lowest rank officer in 20 years. And I'm sure you know about the purges of the military that Xi has been carrying out. So it sounds like he has a pretty firm grasp. Well, okay, so I think he's seeing there's real problems in the defense apparatus. And there's gaps, and there's corruption, and there's all kinds of problems. So he's cracking down on that. You go, you go, you go. So eventually it's going to be a much, much stronger, defense apparatus. So I think regarding security issues, Xi is very much in control, but certainly there are his detractors. There's a lot of turmoil in the party right now, but I see that a lot over economic type issues, where the economy is going, population issues, things of that nature, rather than the security issues.
I mean, I think I completely agree, but I think that's a very, very fair point and important to consider just the vast array of actors and the nuance. I think perhaps more so in security, as you said, there is a little bit more centralized control, but by all means not exclusive. Yeah.
Rupert?
Yeah, and then also I guess with competing interests where, even if you have military capability advances and the possibility of a Taiwan campaign seems more achievable militarily, then it's the cost you factor in. So that was quite interesting with after the Biden-Xi meeting in November 2023, and then the readout from the Chinese side just below the Taiwan section, showed its importance was its concern with the U.S. export restrictions regarding semiconductors, and Xi Jinping saying this could deprive China of its right to development, of the clear development costs. So obviously, if that alarms such a concern, the economic impact of a contingency clearly would be much greater than that. So even if, I don't think it would be a case of if they perceive a campaign as being militarily achievable, it means we go from there. There are, incredible economic costs to consider in that calculus.
Great, thank you. And Yuka?
Thank you very much for the thoughtful question. I think it's a very fair point. I would agree with what's been already said. If you look at, even the South China Sea, is it the Coast Guard? Is it actually the PLAN? Is it actually CCP? It's very difficult to know which ones. It's the same analogy for the Belt and Road Initiative, as you rightly pointed out. I think one exception I would actually say to this rule is this idea of, is a Chinese company a Chinese company, which I think has been debated in UK policy. And I think especially given that that's coming from a very specific kind of political economic space like the UK, it's very different to where you actually have people in Harvard Law School like Mark Wu talk about China Inc., right? So this idea of a Chinese company, is Huawei a private company? Is it actually a state company? These are a little bit different given the political economic system is a little bit different. So I think in terms of the monolithic actor, it's a fair point, but I think in terms of specific strategic key sectors, it's a very different kind of animal. And if I may, I think I missed one question on the North Korea. I'm not a North Korean expert, but from the interviews I've done to date, what I'm actually hearing is that there's been a lot of discussion about the no limits partnership between China and Russia being quite problematic and very weak. But in terms of the cyber sector, in terms of what we're actually seeing cyber warfare in this, what I've actually seen from experts in that area is that if you look at how they're actually acting post the Ukraine war in Ukraine, there's more alignment with the Russia and Chinese on these areas, and there's more information sharing in these areas. So if you think about these partnerships and relations between North Korea, Russia, and China, I think you have to look at by sector, because if you look at cyber warfare, according to these experts, there's more and more alignment.
And actually, if I may just add to that, you can also throw Iran into the mix there, because, for instance, Iran was given full military access to Beidou, and then there are ongoing discussions about joining together elements or even all of GLONASS, Russia's equivalent to GPS, and China's Beidou. So yes, certainly that's a really critical point.
Great. Thank you very much all, panelists and audience alike, for your attention and participation. And with that, we can retire to lunch. Thanks very much.